Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Awesome Albums Extras, where I give you more information about your favorite albums that didn't fit in the original video, something I've learned since I made the original video, or just something that I couldn't figure out where to put it in the original video. So let us spend the next few minutes to discuss an awesome album with a huge tragedy, Lynyrd Skynyrd's Street Survivors. As I mentioned in the original video, just 3 days after the original release of Street Survivors, Lynyrd Skynyrd's plane, the Convair CV-3000, a converted CV-240, crashed into Mississippi on its way to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The plane crash killed vocalist Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, as well as his sister and backup singer Cassie Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and pilots Walter McCreary and William Gray. Everyone else suffered several severe injuries as well. Guitarist Gary Rossington broke both of his arms, his right leg, his pelvis, punctured wounds to both his stomach and liver. Guitarist Alan Collins suffered 2 cracked vertebrae in his neck. Both him and bassist Leon Wilkeson nearly had arms amputated as a result of crash injuries. Wilkeson also suffered several internal injuries, including a punctured lung and most of his teeth knocked out.
Wilkeson and Rossington suffered the most severe injuries.
He has 2 broken arms, a broken leg, a broken pelvis, a punctured stomach, and a punctured liver. And he's going to be in the hospital in Jackson, Mississippi for about another month. But Leon's got tremendous amounts of internal injuries, and Alan's got a broken, not a broken neck, but a cracked neck.
Backing vocalist Leslie Hawkins sustained a concussion, which led to ongoing neurological problems, broke her neck in 3 places, and several facial lacerations. Row crew member Steve Lawler suffered several contusions and facial lacerations as well. Security manager Gene Odom was seriously burned on his arm and face and lost sight in one eye as a result of an emergency flare on board the plane was activated when the plane crashed. An interview with him says that when Ronnie was pulled out, it looked like he was just asleep and not really too many injuries, despite what other people might say. Keyboardist Billy Powell's nose was nearly torn off as he suffered several facial lacerations, as well as the deep lacerations to his right knee. Billy Powell later caused some controversy by giving a colorful story about Cassie Gaines' final moments on the VH1 Behind the Music special about the band, saying that her throat was cut from ear to ear and she bled to death in his arms. He also claims that Van Zant's head was smashed. Now, I don't know who's right, if Billy Powell is right, or if Gene Odom's right. But Powell's version of events was disputed by both drummer Artemis Pyle and Judy Van Zant Jenis, remarried, who posted the autopsy report on the band's website in early 1998 in order to set the record straight. Powell was reprimanded by Pyle and Van Zant Jenis for needlessly upsetting the Gaines family. Nevertheless, Powell remained on good terms with the rest of the members. And back to Artemis Pyle. He was the only member of the band to actually crawl out of the wreckage. He had several broken ribs and hiked some distance from the crash through the swampy woods with road crew members Kenneth Pettin Jr. and Mark Frank. The 3 injured men finally flagged down farmer Johnny Moat. Varying accounts have Moat either firing a warning shot in the air, believing the 3 were escapees from a nearby penitentiary, or, according to Pyle, got shot in the shoulder, despite there being no evidence of that. Moat denies shooting the drummer, and in 1996, Pyle called Moat to thank him for his help after the plane crash. Backing vocalist JoJo Billingsley was not on the plane. She was sick and planned to join the tour in Little Rock, Arkansas on the 23rd. Billingsley claimed that she dreamed the plane crash and begged Alan Collins by telephone not to continue using the Convair. That is a lot of information, and now the question I'm sure you're wondering is, what caused this crash? According to NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, the probable cause was fuel exhaustion and total loss of power from both engines due to crew inattention to the fuel supply, as well as inadequate flight planning. Oh, and there was also an engine malfunction of undetermined nature in the right engine, which resulted in torching and high fuel consumption, just to sum that up. Something odd about this whole incident is it could have been Aerosmith in that plane. The Convair itself had been inspected by members of Aerosmith's flight crew for possible use in early summer of '77, but was rejected because it felt that neither the plane nor the crew were up to the standards. Aerosmith's Assistant Chief of Flight Operations Zunk Bucker tells seeing the pilots McCreary and Gray trading a bottle of Jack Daniels back and forth while inspecting the plane. Aerosmith's touring family was also relieved because the band, specifically Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, had been trying to pressure their management into renting that specific plane. Just think how drastically history would have been if that would have been Aerosmith on that plane instead of Lynyrd Skynyrd. I mean, that could have been Steven Tyler and Joe Perry that died in that plane crash. And I'm glad it wasn't them, because we wouldn't have had Permanent Vacation or Nine Lives or any of the other great albums that Aerosmith made in the 80s or 90s. But I'm now wondering what kind of albums that Ronnie Van Zant and Steve Gaines would have put out if it weren't for that plane crash. I guess we'll never know. It's just so weird and unfortunate of how inaccurate Street Survivors is after everything that happened between the lyrics of the songs, Washington's car accident, and of course this plane crash. I think I need to change the subject. I never got a chance to play the song Jacksonville Kid, but honestly it's really just Honky Tonk Midnight Man with different lyrics. But I just figured I'd go ahead and play a sample for you anyway.
Lord, I still got some good friends, but I feel so all alone.
That was probably my most depressing and most shocking video that I've put on this channel. I apologize. But I do recommend for you to check out both the original album and my original video talking about the album. It is such a sad and tragic story, but the music on there is so good, you have to check them out. This has been Awesome Andrew, reminding you that Lynyrd Skynyrd's Street Survivors is an awesome album, and I will see you guys next time. Hold on. Don't click off the video just yet. I'm not done. Recorded 2 years after the first half, here I am with even more stuff on Lynyrd Skynyrd and Street Survivors. I didn't want to upload the first half before I got a chance to go through the additional facts, and figured I would just tack this on at the end of this video. So who wants story time? I do. Our story begins back in 1975 when Skynyrd was on the road with their third album, Nothing Fancy. In May, guitarist Ed King had left the band. I can't really blame him, because when you have a drunken Ronnie Van Zant threaten you with a broken lamp, you're most likely going to leave. So now this 6-piece band has to continue on, while they used to be a 7-piece band, and they were used to that. They kind of relied on that. And that void continued on when they recorded their next album, Give Me Back My Bullets. I would go into more information there, but then what info will be new if and when I talk about that album? So I'll leave the rest of that information for then. But basically, they had to continue on with only 2 guitarists in Alan and Gary. They were desperate for a guitarist and considered Leslie West of Mountain. That sounded like that would be a great combination. Why didn't that work out? Ego. It pretty much boils down to that. In order for West to join, they would have to change the name to Lynyrd Skynyrd and Leslie West. Pass. After recording Give Me Back My Bullets, Ronnie decided to bring on 3 women to do the backing vocals. All 3 women were handpicked by Ronnie himself. Artemis described Cassie Gaines as like a Broadway singer. Leslie Hawkins sang soprano, or their songbird as he described. And JoJo Billingsley, or the Honky Tonk Queen, had a little bit more of a rough voice. But their blend was great and people loved them. Cassie Gaines kept recommending her younger brother, Steve. They disregarded it. Of course a sister's going to say that her brother's the greatest guitar player ever. They decided to have him jam on Call Me the Breeze because it's just a simple chord progression. You can't screw that up. They told Kevin Elson that if he was bad, turn him off. When Steve showed up, he pulls a slide out of his pocket and starts shredding, blowing Alan and Gary away. After the show, they walked up to him and said, "Quit whatever band you're in, you're coming with us." And they threw him in the van. He didn't even have a suitcase. Ronnie Van Zant said, "I'll expect we'll all be in Steve's shadow one day. This kid is a writing and playing fool. He's already scared everybody into playing their best in years." End quote. They didn't want to let Steve in on their crazy drunkenness, at least not yet. With their new guitar player, the band decided to record a live album in July across 3 dates at Atlanta's Fox Theater. They wanted to re-establish their energy on record, so they released the album One More From the Road in September of 1976, which is a fantastic live album. I don't know how I'd be able to talk about a live album on this channel, since all the songs on the album are on different albums. So here's a little plug-in saying that this has been Awesome Andrew telling you that Lynyrd Skynyrd's One More From the Road is an awesome album. Now back to Street Survivors. In August of '76, they landed a gig at the Network Fair opening for the Rolling Stones, which was incredible for Ronnie to open up for the guys who inspired him to go into music in the first place. They played and they were amazing. During a guitar solo, and Steve Gaines was just shredding and being amazing, and Ronnie takes a few steps back and has a huge smile on his face on just how amazing his new guitar player is. Then the Rolling Stones came out, 2 hours late, incredibly drunk, barely able to stand up, and horrible. Skynyrd is what saved that show. Skynyrd was the highlight. Later on after this, and after One More From the Road came out, the band decided they needed to control their substance abuse issues. Both Rosington and Collins were injured in car accidents involving alcohol. Rosington passed out behind the wheel of his car, and he was going so fast and slammed into an oak tree. Fortunately, he emerged from the wreckage reasonably unscathed, but still needed to go to the hospital, thus canceling 6 dates of their tour. Dean Kilpatrick, who was in the car, had to get surgery on his spleen. Alan Collins had driven his Jeep over an embankment. Powell was in a motorcycle accident and fractured his skull, and Artemis shattered his leg in an alcohol-related incident. Billy Powell reflected later on in the band's drunkenness, most notably Ronnie, and said, "He was kind of scary when he was drinking, because it made him like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I always tried to keep out of Ronnie's way when he was drunk, but when he was sober, he was the neatest, coolest guy I've ever met. You could sit there all night and listen to him tell true stories about the things he'd done. He was a gentleman until he started drinking. But the same was true of the rest of us in those days, and therein lies the problem." Quote. Rosington's accident was the final straw. Things needed to change. Van Zandt told Gene Odom that things needed to change. Odom takes it upon himself to be the first one to get to the next venue and dump all the alcohol so the band wouldn't be tempted to drink. Although they might still go to a bar and get drunk. But at least it helped a lot, and they have expressed their thanks several times for what he was doing or what he was trying to do. Moving into February of 1977, things were going pretty well. They had some demos of songs, but they decided to transfer to Criteria Studios in Miami to work with producer Tom Dowd, who was there on Bullets. But Kevin Ellison said the recordings were very thin and weak, so they abandoned that studio for Studio One, where they recorded their big hits like Sweet Home Alabama and Saturday Night Special. Billy Powell said maybe Tom was getting too old, or his ears weren't as good as they had been. Either way, we put a stop to it, end quote. Dowd's name was taken off from the credits. They unfortunately had to trash the old recordings, estimating about $70,000 worth of footage, but they couldn't do anything about the re-recording yet, as there was a tour that was already scheduled, so they set off for this 2-month tour. After their tour, they went back to Studio One, and then Muscle Shoals in Doraville, Georgia. Ronnie Van Zant himself oversaw the album's completion. The album was finally released in October of 1977 with some of the band's best songs since their second album, Second Helping. This album was so good because it was a mix between Steve Gaines' guitar work and it had some of Ronnie's best written songs, possibly due to Steve being there. Artemis reflected on how great Street Survivors was, hoping that maybe original drummer Bob Burns can come back and have 2 drummers, and maybe Ed King can come back and write a song or play a song. This album was the band's turnaround album. They started their tour for Street Survivors, where they played the songs from their new album, as well as old favorites like Sweet Home Alabama and Freebird, the ones you expect from a Skynyrd show. Manager Peter Retch, who had been there since Nothing Fancy, leased a private plane for the band to save on costs. Unfortunately, as you probably know, the plane he picked out had seen better days. The plane had delivered them safely to their first 4 tour dates. However, on their way to Greenville, South Carolina, it was revealed to them just how unsafe this plane was. Artemis remembered seeing flames shooting out of the side of the engine. They called a mechanic in Texas who was going to meet them in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which was their next stop, to fix the plane. There were rumors that the band members had been forced on the plane. Rosington now acknowledges those rumors. That's true. Alan and Billy didn't want to get up on it, but Ronnie was gung-ho and told him if it was his time, then it was his time. We were going. Ronnie said as long as they got to the next show, he didn't care how they managed it, and everybody followed the leader, end quote. Official reports afterward said that the pilots had miscalculated the amount of fuel bought before they took off in Lakeland, Florida, and when they refueled in Greenville, they believed the tank was more full than it actually was. When the plane began experiencing problems which required the pilots to operate the plane's starboard side engine was in the auto-rich position, the fuel they did have burned away at an excessive rate. It was calculated there was about 207 gallons that were unaccounted for, which is probably enough to fill up my tank for an entire year, or at least pretty close. Gene Odom recalls that they were up in the air and Ronnie was hollering for him to get back to play poker. Gene ran up to the cockpit to talk to the pilots because he heard something going on with that engine. He wanted to tell them about the engine. During the flight, Ronnie told Gene that he took some sleeping pills. He had been up all night and needs to get some sleep. So I apologize for what I said in the original video about Ronnie being drunk here. The band made an effort to stay sober on this tour, and drugs and alcohol were banned in the dressing rooms. I find that a little odd because when the plane went down, Van Zandt was drunk and refused to wear his seatbelt. That's what caused that blow to the head, which unfortunately took him. He wasn't necessarily sober. He was groggy from the sleeping pills, but not drunk. The plane was starting to run out of fuel. Artemis started going around telling everybody to put out their cigarettes, conserve power, and brace for impact. He goes up to talk to the pilots, who, with fear in their eyes, tell him, strap in. Gene grabs a sleeping Ronnie from the floor and puts him between Alan and Gary. He tells him that the plane's crashing, he needs to strap in. Ronnie responds, stop messing with me, Gene. I'm not messing with you. The plane is going to crash. He straps Ronnie in, although he has a strong feeling that Ronnie unstrapped himself. He tells him to put his head down as somebody yells, trees. They were right on top of the trees. Artemis remembers feeling the trees scraping against the bottom of the plane.
All I saw was treetops. I looked out my window. I was in the middle of the airplane on the right wing. I tried to get close to the back of the airplane as possible. But I got in the middle of the airplane on the right wing, and all I saw was treetops. And at first it wasn't so bad, but then when it hit the middle of the trees, it was horrible. It's an experience nobody wants to ever experience. Never.
The pilots see the field up ahead that they're going to land at. They put the landing gear down, but since they weren't quite clear of the trees yet, the landing gear got caught in the trees, which then puts their plane at a 45-degree angle. Artemis just watches in horror as the right wing gets torn off of it. The plane lands. Fortunately, since there was no gas left, there was no fire or explosion. Every seat but one had been ripped up from the floor, and some of the victims had been thrown through the shattered fuselage.
You can't even realize, seeing one of these things on television, exactly what a crash of this magnitude looks like. Up there, sitting against the tree, is a piece of an airplane wing, torn away from the rest of the airplane. Lying down there, at the base of the tree, is the engine. And that back there, that twisted metal back there, is the fuselage of the plane, which sort of was turned around a corner.
Remember me saying that Powell's nose was almost torn off his face? Well, Gene crawled toward him in the dark and tried to touch it, and Powell pushed him away, fearing he might lose it in the mud. Billy Powell said later that during the plane crash, he was lying there and reflecting on Ronnie and his abusive drunken nature. You want the truth? I've never shared this with anybody. As time went by, I'd kind of forgiven Ronnie for my teeth. But right before the plane crash, I was getting really fed up with it all. The strangest memory of my life is that when that plane came down, I wasn't knocked unconscious like all the rest. One of my first thoughts was, thank God it's over. I don't have to get beaten up anymore. Even without asking anyone, I knew in my heart that Ronnie was dead, and it was a relief. It didn't last long, of course. I wanted the beating to stop, but not like it did. I knew that Steve was dead too, but I didn't know about Cassie. It took 3 years for all the survivors to collect our thoughts and get over the bitterness. Although both pilots paid with their lives, it took me a long time for me to stop being mad at them." End quote. Now, this statement he said here is different than what he said in the VH1 documentary, where he said that Cassie died in his arms. Now, I understand memory is faulty, but that's a huge contradiction. But I guess in the end, the result is unfortunately the same. The band was taken to different hospitals, and they didn't know who made it or who didn't until way later. The public knew before the band did. Anyway, who came to help grab pieces of the plane, stole from them, wallets or whatever. Like I said, the public knew immediately, including Ed King and Bob Burns, who watched the horror on the news. Original producer and friend Al Cooper said he saw it on the news that evening and watched it all night because he had to know who made it and who didn't. Bob Burns wrote down as he watched. The doctor came into Artemis's hospital room and said, "You've been asking who made it." He asked, "Are you ready for the news?" Artemis nods his head. "Yeah." The doctor said Ronnie Van Zant was killed. Artemis responds, "Yeah, I knew that." But when he heard about Steve and Cassie, that's what hit him hard. Everyone liked Steve. He was a great guy and a great friend. Really chill, really mellow. Gene didn't leave the hospital until about after a month. He wanted to visit Ronnie, so he was taken to the cemetery. He asked, "What are we doing here?" That's when he learned Ronnie didn't make it. Nobody told him until a month later. This playing led to the end of Lynyrd Skynyrd, at least for a while. The band broke up to pursue other interests. I know Alan Collins and Gary Rosington formed the Rosington-Collins Band, for example, with Leon Wilkeson and Billy Powell in the band too. They did have a reunion tour in 1987 as part of a 10-year anniversary tribute to the incident. Leon Wilkeson, Gary Rosington, Billy Powell, Artemis Pyle were all there. Ed King came back for the tour. Ronnie's younger brother, Johnny Van Zant, came in as the new singer of Skynyrd. Alan Collins, who had suffered another car accident a year earlier, was confined to a wheelchair and acted as the musical director. The tour was so successful, the band decided to continue where they are still playing to this day, although wrapping up the tour. Unfortunately, several other members have passed away over the years, and the only Crash lineup member still touring is Gary Rosington. Artemis is still alive, but has since retired. Lynyrd Skynyrd has some of the most unfortunate events that I know of in music. It's sad to think about, really, and all I can think of is the best way to remember them and keep them alive is to just keep on enjoying their music. If you haven't listened to Street Survivors yet, or any of their other albums, I recommend the pre-Crash albums with Ronnie on vocals, and you definitely can't go wrong with Street Survivors, which has one solid song after another. This has been Awesome Andrew, reminding you that Lynyrd Skynyrd's Street Survivors is an awesome album, and I will see you all in another video. I'm for real done now.